Right. Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, wherever you are in the world, to this webinar. To start with, just would like to say that this webinar is part of a series of webinars, part of our center, which is the UKRI Interdisciplinary Center for Circular Economy for the mineral construction materials. And today's webinar looking at reuse of materials as case studies, as a case study, and then looking at the refurbishment project. And it's going to last 45 minutes. We have Peter, I'll introduce in a second. But before we do that, the meeting is being recorded for your information. So if you don't wish to appear in the recording, please keep your cameras off. Like I said, the webinar is around 20 minutes, and then we have got an opportunity later on for question and answers. Please, if you have got any questions, the best way to do it is if you can type it in the chat, or after Peter finishes his presentation, you can raise your digital hand and I'll be moderating that. And of course, in the end, all that recording will be available for all the interested parties and people who are interested in reviewing the contents of the presentation and the Q&A would be shared through our social media early next week. So, like I said, today's keynote speaker is Peter. Peter Kelly is the Group Director for Sustainable Operation at ICEC, which is a global construction specialist specializing in various services, construction, fit-out services and engineering. He's wearing a lot of hats, Peter. The main hat is with ICEC is responsible for the strategy, the ICEC strategy, which is looking at net zero carbon, circular economy, social value, and environmental enhancement. But I've got other hats. I had the pleasure to work with Peter in different committees, including the latest Green Construction Board Committee, which culminated in the development of the roadmap for zero avoidable waste in construction in England. And as well, the UK Green Construction Building program focusing on system enablers for circular economy. So that's just a brief introduction to Peter, and now I'll let the floor to Peter for his presentation. All yours, Peter. Thank you very much.
No problem. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this webinar this morning. Just share my screen. And hopefully that's come up for everybody. So I'm going to talk about a very specific case study today of a refurbishment of a building in Cambridge that is now known as the Entopia Building. So this is the building as it was in Cambridge, central Cambridge on Regent Street. A number of partners, as usual in any construction project involved. Some funders around Envision, BDP, Archetype, and 3PM were the client side, and there was some extra funding from the European Union and the government. So the building is a 1930s former telephone exchange, converted for office use in the 1990s. And the outcome of this is to be the new headquarters of the Cambridge Institute of Sustainability Leadership. So they were based in a number of offices and still are at this present moment in time across Cambridge. But in the next literally week or two, they'll be coming together to occupy their new headquarters. And given their title of the Institute of Sustainability Leadership, they felt it was only right that they led in terms of how they refurbished this building. I'm going to touch on some of the sustainability requirements that we had to deliver, and then I'll focus a bit more on the circular economy principles alone. So I mentioned who's been involved. You can see, if you're familiar with the REBA stages, who is involved all the way from stage 1 through to completion. This was a slightly unusual project in construction terms, in that the architect from client side, archetype, and the MEP and structural engineer, BDP, stayed client side. They weren't novated to us, typically at stage 4. So those companies, 3PM as the project manager, G&T as the QS, and then Archetype and BDP remain client side throughout the project. And ISG as the winning contractor then employed our own architect, a Cambridge-based Fielden and Mawson, the Cambridge-based office of Max Fordham, and then CAR, a very local structural engineer, to take forward the stage 4 technical design through to completion. So I'm just going to show a very short video to give you an overview.
In the UK, the built environment contributes around 40% to the UK's carbon emissions, and around 23% of that is associated directly with buildings, both direct and indirect emissions. So CIS Hill has this wonderful opportunity to convert a 1930s telephone exchange into a deeply retrofitted, ultra-modern new headquarters.
So this project is a deep retrofit. It's a fabric first retrofit, and we have corrected defects that are in this building that go back to when it was first built in the 1930s. And it is about setting up this building for a 100-year life in the future. We've pretty much covered off everything we can do to make it lean, efficient, usable, and fit for purpose. The sustainability standards for this project are some of the most ambitious that have ever been set for any built environment project. They include targeting the BREEAM standard to a level of outstanding, targeting the low energy passive house standard, what we call ENERFIT, layering on top of that the WELL standard for the user and for sustainable health and well-being. And then if that isn't enough, we included carbon target. In addition to that, we said it should be an exemplar of circular economy in actual practice. So putting together all of these criteria makes this project one of the most ambitious projects in the built environment sector.
We are trying to make a building that isn't really designed or constructed with great air tightness in mind, almost completely airtight. We're getting certified too on this building, so we need to make sure that we're checking, double checking, triple checking every time to make sure everything we introduce into the design and on-site and construction is compliant with everything across the board.
We have an extraordinary opportunity. We have 30 years of working at the cutting edge. We have networks right the way across the world. We have Cambridge in our name, but we're a thoroughly global institution. Now that we will have the Entopia Building, that network will have a go-to home, both virtually and physically. It's so cool to think that a former telephone exchange, the old technology, could now become the catalyst for some of the world's most important leadership and innovation to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by the end of this decade of action.
Okay, so picking up on some of those sustainability requirements, and I think this is a really good place to start, is the hoarding, where we came up with a slogan to try and entice people to engage with the project. And that's around the fact that it isn't an ordinary project, but it needs to be. And that's what we need to push into the built environment. Is a lot of the techniques adopted in this refurbishment need to become far more standard than they are now at this time. So John French mentioned the sustainability requirements that were placed upon us as a contractor and through the design stage from stage 4 onwards to complete. The ENERFIT was particularly challenging in terms of the retrofit passive house standard for a project and building of this size and complexity. And then on top of that, in order to meet, as Nick Woodmore said, those air tightness requirements, we had to make sure that all the materials we used met the BREEAM, WELL and bio-based targets. The great thing about this for me personally, on top of that, was the circular economy, and that led us to really think differently about how we could approach this project. Having such an enlightened client that were willing to accept reused products on site really helped open our minds to the possibilities of what we could implement. And I'm going to take you through some of those examples now. But first of all, what does the circular economy mean to ISG? And I've spent some time, as you can imagine, thinking about this. And what we've tried to do is distill it into the way we want to work as a company going forward. And that means that we want to change the way we design, procure, and install those product systems and materials. So at the end of use or the end of life, they can be reused, repurposed, remanufactured, preferably before being recycled, at their highest value without causing adverse environmental impact, and then importantly at cost neutral or less. So it's really important that we have a clear definition of what we're trying to achieve at ISG and hopefully other contractors in terms of the reuse of those products, systems, materials, and really making sure that reuse, repurpose, remanufacture is much higher up the use and the value chain than any recycling or downcycling. So the first real success, and for a number of reasons, was the reuse of some LED lighting. So we had a project in central London in St. James's Place, where we had 7 or 8 floors of Cat A space, which a tenant had taken. The tenant decided that they wanted to change the Cat A, but put a real emphasis on reuse as much as possible of that existing Cat A. And that allowed us to take down a lot of those ceilings that you can see in the picture on the left, the grills, a lot of the signage. A lot of that was taken away by a company called Collect Eco, and they passed that on to third parties that then reinstalled those ceilings in various settings across the UK. But what we decided to do was to keep the light fittings. They'd been installed for a couple of years. They were hardly used. The Cat 8 space hadn't been widely used at all. It had just been vacant. So the lights were in perfect condition, very little use. And we managed to trace the original manufacturer, a company called Specials Lighting Design. And I literally contacted the managing director of that company and said, we have circa 360 odd lights available that we've carefully removed from a project in central London. Would you be happy to take those back, test them, and then warranty them and allow us to reinstall them on another project? And the managing director was like, well, we've never done it before, but yeah, why not? Send them back. We'll do some batch testing. And if they're all up to scratch, then we'll honor the existing warranty on those lights. They knew exactly where they'd been installed, who installed them. They remembered the job very clearly. So it meant it easy for us to remove those lights very carefully. Collect Eco initially stored them. They got them over to Specials Lighting, and that allowed us to test and honor the original warranty. So you can see here how well they came out. The other interesting thing to note is that these lights aren't actually supposed to be designed to be seen in the ceiling. They're supposed to be hidden, so you only see the actual light itself, as you saw in the first picture. So they're not exactly supposed to be seen in terms of the whole light fitting. It's supposed to be in bed in a ceiling. But obviously, because of the nature of exposed ceilings and quite an industrial feel with exposed raised access floor at CISL and the Entopia Building, it meant that actually the lights looked really good when they were installed and fitted in quite well with the overall design ethic of the building. So Specials took them back. They added some hangers. You can see the steel wires hanging down on the lights to allow them to be installed into the ceiling. And they also installed an LED strip lighting on top of the lights, which allowed some uplighting to shine back up onto the ceiling. So, you know, really, really proud of the fact that we managed to remove those lights, get them back to the original manufacturer. They did some modifications and some retesting, and now they're carefully reinstalled back in a project with the original warranty guaranteed. And potentially opportunities for specials lighting to do similar in the future. So really delighted. I think they came out really well. I think they look really good. And we gained an extra 1% in BREEAM for doing this, because BREEAM in an innovation credit couldn't find anywhere globally where this had been done before. So we did apply for 4 innovations overall, but this is the only one they guaranteed they couldn't find was unique and hadn't been done before. So we're delighted that we've managed to install that. And of course, the client was also also very happy to have installed secondhand lights, in theory secondhand, although they were hardly used, as part of their project. So the other thing we did, excuse me, is we spoke to the former Philips Lighting, which is now Signify. They have 3D printed light fittings available to use. These light fittings, when they come to end of use or end of life, can be ground down back in their process and recast as light fittings again up to 7 times. So they can literally take that light fitting, grind it down into its constituent plastics, and then put it back into their process to be recast as a pendant light again. So very low carbon, very lightweight, and we've managed to introduce them into the areas where there was particularly need for something other than the standard light fittings. And you can see them here hanging from the reception area, those particular light fittings from Signify. So the next success we had, and this one I actually kept quiet from the client. The first ones, obviously, we had to get some buy-in from the client because we had to change the lighting design to allow for that type of light fitting. This time, I wasn't quite sure whether this would work. So I have known a gentleman called Roy Fishwick at Cleveland Steel for some time, who's been very active in the reuse of steel market, but has traditionally only focused in circular steel from the oil and gas industries. But I contacted him and said, what's the chances that you might have some rolled steel lying around that you might be able to use, given that the actual application was relatively small in this case? And he said, well, funnily enough, I've just received a container load of steel from the Marvel Studios in London, where the Eternals movie was being shot, and the cameras are running on steel rails. And once they've finished the shoot, they were potentially going to scrap that steel. Again, by a little piece of luck, there was a gentleman called Charlie Law, who I've also known from years, who was working on the studios at the time as a sustainability advisor, and said that we could sell that steel rather than have it scrapped and recycled. So he arranged for the sale of that steel to Cleveland Steel. I just happened to contact Roy at the right time. He told us what lengths of steel we had. I was then able to contact the structural engineer CAR in Cambridge. They said that the lengths of steel that were available would work in the design, with a bit of modification, a very minor piece of modification. So we were able to rejig this line design slightly to incorporate the steel that Roy had. You can see it here looking a bit rusty on the left, but as you can see on the right, it needed to be galvanized anyway. So Roy had the original certification of the steel for CE marking from Charlie, who had the original certs. He was able to do some testing on the steel, shot blast it, cut it to the right lengths, and get it sent to our subcontractor, the fabricator Harleston, who were then able to treat it appropriately, to galvanize it, and then get it to site and install it. So the restriction here was the hoist. We had quite a small hoist, so the steel sections had to be cut to allow them to be brought up in the hoist and bolted together to create the photovoltaic panel. So again, another final photograph of it installed in site. So all the framework steel that the PV sits on is reused from that Marvel studio. So another really good example of a fairly easy and straightforward process from having the right contacts to be able to procure that steel, get some buy-in from the structural engineer, get some buy-in from the subcontractor, the fabricator, Halston, who only needed the CE marking from the steel and some testing, and they were able to accept that steel and galvanize it and get it to site. Luckily, the steel was in pretty good condition. It hadn't had a lot of dings and dents and cuts and holes drilled in it. So it was a pretty easy sell to Halston. And again, the client were delighted that the steel frame of their PV canopy is all reused steel. Finally, just to touch on the reception desk. The original reception desk at the Entopia Building wasn't the best. It was put in storage for reuse on site, but we felt it really didn't set off the whole reception area. So we managed to take on the Copyright Building in central London for Netflix. Unfortunately, their security demands meant that they needed to redesign the reception area, which meant a desk of this size just wasn't going to work for them. So we managed to contact the original installer, which is on our supply chain, Benchmark Joinery. They came in and removed it. The top did crack, unfortunately. It wasn't installed for reuse, and that's something that they agree that they will take on as part of their furniture design going forward to allow their furniture to be more deconstructible going forward. But also the reception desk had to be modified to allow it to a disabled person in a wheelchair to access the reception desk. So they had to modify it anyway, which meant they could take it back to their workshop, do the modifications, and keep 50% of the tavatine top with a minor repair required to a crack. So again, you can see this beautiful reception desk designed by Piercy & Co, a very high quality architectural practice with Bill Amberg leatherwork, and then taken from the Copyright Building back to Benchmark. They did some minor modifications and then reinstalled in the front reception area of the Institute. And I think it really sets off that area. A really beautiful piece of furniture, an expensive piece of furniture that was rehomed elsewhere. So just to wrap up, I think there are materials out there if you know where to look, and if you've got a bit of, if you want to put a bit of effort in, there are materials out there to find. If you ask the right questions of the right people, then it's not as easy as it should be, but there are materials out there. Take a punt, take a risk, talk to people. All I did, as I said, was contact Specials Lighting, and they were more than happy to accommodate. They wouldn't have got any money out of us anyway, because we would have bought new lighting probably from Signify. So for them to make some money out of testing and doing some modifications to the existing lights, then they made, they could see a business market in that going forward. And really and truly, all three examples were relatively straightforward. We hit very few issues with the client. We hit very few issues with the MEP designer and installer for the lighting. And we hit very few issues with the steel supply chain and our own Halston group who fabricated and installed. So it really is easier than you think if you put a little bit of effort in, take some time and speak to the right people. That's it from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Peter, for this really inspiring presentation and quite a nice, simple 3 steps takeaways from your experience. It has been fascinating looking at how simple it is to reuse, as long as there is a will and there is a team working and belief in the issue. Please feel free, I can't see any question in the chat. Feel free to type in your question in the chat or just raise your digital hand. While we are waiting for that, Peter, I've got a couple of questions. I think it has been really, I was very impressed with the BREEAM innovation in terms of the LED lights. So you gave it a second life. So what do you think about the third life, fourth life possible?
They are designed to, as you probably know, LED lights for a certain amount of lux level and then a certain amount of time in use. So I think that's where a lot of manufacturers are moving towards, is having sensors in lighting that can say how along that journey of lifetime the lights are at. So I expect, although there'll be arbitrary 3-year warranties given on products, because that's what the industry is used to and that's what people expect, I would imagine that a lot of lighting manufacturers will eventually work off the back of a sensor telling them how much more life is in that fitting going forward. So there are lighting manufacturers already looking at this and already looking at their design of their fittings to allow them to be much more circular going forward. There are even lighting manufacturers to this date that will take someone else's manufactured lighting and remanufacture it with their own products. So circularity is probably the most developed in the lighting world, and that's really great to see. And I expect them to, with the massive impact that sensor technology will have, I expect them to know how long from the sensor that light will have left in it, and that will allow them into the second and third life going forward. Or if it does reach its end of life, then they will be able to upgrade the majority of that light fitting rather than literally ditching the whole thing and starting again.
Absolutely. I think that's really a good way forward in thinking about it. And I can see now some questions coming. Irene, to start with, she's talking about the concept of social value, which was mentioned at the beginning. And she's asking if it's possible to talk a bit more about how you dealt with the process of creating social value throughout the project.
So social value for us is very much about leaving a legacy. So at the minute, a lot of social value is measured on how much monetary value is placed into the community. We want to shift the dial a bit away from a monetary value, more to a lasting legacy that we're able to measure post-project. So we have a number of metrics that we've built into this, this project. Obviously not just in social value, but of course making sure that the project has a post-occupancy plan for how it performs, but also around what the client is trying to achieve. So some of this space is going to be rented at very low rates to startup companies that are specifically working on sustainability challenges. So we're going to partner in a way that shows that social value has come as a result of the building and how those startups have an impact on the community in terms of getting people into work, people into work postgraduate, people into work not from a graduate background from the local area, because like any area, Cambridge does have some areas where there's some areas of deprivation, etc. So that's the kind of thing that we're partnering with the client with, to make sure that social value lasts way beyond what we do in the construction phase and ties in with what they're trying to achieve with the building now it's open or shortly to be open. Hope that answers your question.
Irene, are you happy with that, Irene?
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
So we move to the second. Irene as well is a postdoc in the project, and then we have Fea. is another postdoc looking at policy. She's dealing with policy and construction law related to circular economy. So she's her question is about policy, of course. So what measures do you think policy would make it easy to find material for such project? And at the same time, do you think were existing regulation a barrier to going for as far as you wanted to go in terms of incorporating circular economy principles into the project?
Well, I think the answer is the same for both sides of that question, and that is the VAT that is levied on refurbishment projects. So there's been a lot of conversations about this for a long time and a lot of lobbying to government that there shouldn't be a VAT cost to refurbishment. There is no cost of VAT to new build, whereas there is for refurbishment. And that would immediately have a big impact in terms of favoring refurbishment over new build, and therefore drive the market in reused materials. So that would be the big lever I think any government or any policy person could really quite easily implement. Whether it has huge impacts financially for the tax man, I wouldn't be able to answer. I assume they do, or perhaps they would have done it by now. But that would be some sort of mechanism to encourage refurbishment of buildings over new build or demolition would be the big lever I would pull. The biggest challenge overall in reuse is simply the supply and demand. There isn't the obvious having the material there when you need it. There's often lots of materials that you don't particularly need at that time. And that's only going to change with scale. So there's lots of work ongoing in the industry about how we can find storage space, existing storage space, how we can use our existing logistics contractors to remove materials and store them. And then you've got the challenge of a system whereby they can be advertised. And this is why Amazon is so successful, isn't it? Because they've got the logistics, they've got the storage, and they've got the platform that allows you to easily access whatever you like. We need something that overcomes that in the reuse market. And there's lots of different players that do different parts. So there's logistics contractors that have some storage. There's some storage that don't have the logistics, and there are some that have a platform that can advertise your product but don't have the storage and logistics. So we're currently working to try and bring some of those players together to join that loop up that allow materials from not just ISG, but hopefully as many contractors as possible to get material back into storage, re-advertise it, and get it back out into construction again. Because if ISG tries to do this alone, we will never have the project that needs that particular material. Whereas if there's Ceramic Calpine and all the other companies, there might be a chance that they need the materials that we are donating just when they need them. And the more people get involved, the more likelihood there's more materials available too. So watch this space, a lot of conversations, but any policy needs to deal with logistics, storage, and redistribution of materials, and an ability to advertise them. And I'm not sure that will be dealt with via policy. I think it will be dealt in the private sector.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter. There is a question regarding your reference to the reuse of steel. And that's a question from Yingli Wang, talking about what measures are in place to make sure that the quality of the steel is fit for the purpose, especially for its second life, and how can we scale up this type of reuse?
So there is a industry protocol for the reuse of steel, which has really, I wouldn't say opened the floodgates, but has certainly opened the door for more reuse, because it gives certainty around what someone will accept in terms of reuse of steel. The biggest challenge is paperwork. So where you've got good paperwork, which we had, of provenance of steel, then it makes life a lot easier and you have to do less destructive testing. So the more paperwork we can have, which comes back to the materials passporting world, the more information at our fingertips in terms of the original steel, the easier it is to reuse that steel. If you don't have the original documentation, then it comes to destructive testing, which people like Cleveland can do, and they can then recertify that steel as if new. There are the main challenges around quality is more about how it looks, funnily enough, because if you're removing steel from an original steel building, it often has been cut, drilled. There are flanges, there are all sorts of things attached to that steel, which architecturally may not be acceptable to an architect or a client. So we have a project at the minute we are looking at where the original steel in the building, we can hopefully reuse as much of it as possible because it will be boxed in. You won't see it. It'll be behind a ceiling or boxed in by plasterboard. So that immediately overcomes the issue around how it looks if it's got a few dings and dents in it. So quality issues are overcome either by having the original paperwork and some minor testing, or major testing if you haven't got the original paperwork. And then you have to get some buy-in from the architect or the client or both if any of that steelwork is going to be exposed, because it generally won't look brand new steel because of the very nature of how it's been treated in its past.
Thank you, Peter. I've got a couple of more questions. The first one is looking at the possibility to reuse load-bearing components such as wall panels or columns. In your views, do you think the potential challenges for such reuse?
Huge challenges, yeah. I think, unfortunately, a lot of how we build currently doesn't allow for reuse. So the challenges around something that's load-bearing being reusable in the future has to mean reuse is designed in. So that something is load-bearing, but you can demount it or deconstruct it to allow that to be moved elsewhere and reused. At the minute, when something is generally load-bearing, it has to be cut because it's been attached in a way that allows for that strength. And as soon as you cut it, it usually means that it needs to be recycled because no one will accept that it's still got those same strength properties. So it's a massive challenge, and one that structural engineers, I think, probably don't have the answers to as well as I. I think for it to be more available, or materials to be more available in the future, they have to be designed with reuse in purpose, reuse in mind. Whereas at the minute, I think it's probably in the too hard box in terms of time and effort to get something that's load bearing into reuse again. It's probably just quicker and easier to, unfortunately, build new.
Thank you, Peter. I think the last comment, it's more of a comment than a question. So it's looking at the relationship between existing owners, end users, and manufacturers. So the comment is all about it would be easier if existing owners were required or even incentivized to return scrap material to the manufacturer, so they can then recondition and resell them with a warranty. And then they want to, and I think from Michael Dicken, this comment, trying to find useful scrap material on the open market is rather hit and miss. But if he carries on by saying, if I could go directly to the manufacturer and buy it with a warranty, it would be straightforward.
Agreed, totally agree. And we are pushing some manufacturers to have a second life available product. And to be honest, it's not particularly circular economy that's driving that, it's more embodied carbon. A lot of our clients are very, very worried and are starting to set targets on embodied carbon. And obviously the one way you can try and reduce that is to reuse materials. So we are in conversations with a number of manufacturers. It's very alien to them, if I'm brutally honest. They are very set up in a linear fashion to take, make, and sell and not get back again. So I think the answer will be horses for courses. I think there'll be some manufacturers that embrace this and take it on. There are others that it's just too alien for them and they won't be able to embrace it. And that's where there'll be another sector of companies that are taking on materials, repurposing them and rewarranting them, but they're not the original manufacturer. So there's a really good example of RMF, raised modular flooring, who are taking Kingspan flooring wherever they can get it, and they're re-warranty that, retesting it and sending it out with the same warranty that Kingspan would. So we expect a growth in those type of companies taking on materials and selling them as with warranties. And we're expecting some of those manufacturers, those bigger manufacturers, to realize that there is a driver for this, if not for circularity, then embodied carbon, and to take it on. But not everyone will, or at the minute, certainly it's proving to be quite an alien concept to some of those bigger manufacturers.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Peter. I think Yingli, who asked earlier question, she just wanted you to elaborate a little bit more on material passport concept. I think that's something, Yingli, you can look at it. I think lots of going on in material passport. Maybe a good stop for you is to look at an EU project has been completed called BAMB, B-A-M-B. It gives you quite a lot of details about it, but maybe Peter can briefly comment on that, because I'm aware of the time. I have 2 minutes to go. And the final question is from Fia again, looking at extended producer responsibility. Will it make such a requirement, do you think, to take back mandatory and make it less alien?
Taking the last point first, I'm not sure. I don't know enough about producer responsibility. I think there's a very lack of push from this government to do anything, and their general outlook is, if you think it should be done, get on with it yourselves. So whether they would go that radical in a piece of legislation, I question. And then going back to the materials passports, there's a really good working group, particularly in construction, at the building level, being run by a lady called Rachel Houlihan from Orms Architects. So if you're interested in materials passporting, they've done most of the really good thinking in this space, and we're part of that support to try and roll it out on some specific materials in the construction industry.
Peter, thank you very much indeed. So I'm aware of the time. We just want to finish on time. I think it has been really a pleasure and and would like to thank you for your insightful presentation.
No problem. Thank you all. Thank you for having me.
Really very helpful and good debate as well in question and answers. Again, thank you on behalf of all the attendees and the center's colleagues. Thank you so much for your time, Peter. Just would like to just remind everybody about, if you would like to have more information about what we are doing in our Circular Economy Center for Mineral Construction Materials, please get in touch. These are the links in the screen. And then part of the series of webinars, the next one, which will be by Antenna Papa Costa on the 11th of October, same time. And then we have another one as well with coronavirus in October, and then we will get more information and details about it in due course. Meanwhile, thank you all very much indeed for attending this webinar, and most importantly, thank you to Peter for his time and patience in answering all the questions.
No problem. Enjoyed it. Thank you, Mohammed.
Thank you very much, Peter. I look forward to seeing you all in the next webinar. Thank you very much indeed. Take care. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Cheers.